So I want to introduce Dr. Schumm today doing his sabbatical talk. He's been at Monmouth College for 10 years. His undergraduate degree is a BS in dietetics from Bradley University. He has an MS in exercise science from Appalachian State, and a PhD from Ohio University in biological sciences with a specialty in exercise physiology and muscle biology. And his current interest is holistic human movement and non-exercise movement.
Okay, so we'll talk about this. One thing that people don't know, having gone to Appalachian State, they find it very improper to say Appalachian State. No one outside of that area would know that, but fun fact, Appalachian State. So they're pretty serious about that stuff. So I'm going to talk about human movement beyond exercise. This is something that I've been interested in, for a little while. And, obviously the formal training is exercise. All the departments in different universities and colleges is exercise science. The focus in the medical world is exercise. But there's all this time and movement that we can do outside of exercise. But the thing is, realistically, most people say, like, I need to move more, and they say, I need to exercise, right? Well, that's one way to move more, but it's not the only way. So the first thing I want to talk about is, let's go ahead and just define what physical activity versus exercise is, so that we're sort of speaking the same language. Now, this comes from Daniel Lieberman, who's an evolutionary biologist from Harvard. And it's in the book, one of the books that I read. And I like this, it clarifies things, right? Physical activity is any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles that expends energy. So that's anything, right? I'm doing physical activity right now, but I'm not exercising. Why? Because it's not voluntary physical activity that is planned, structured, repetitive, and undertaken to sustain or improve health and fitness. So we see that the definition of exercise is much more narrow. People tend to think of, oh, human movement, they think exercise. Well, actually, exercise is a small little sliver of human movement, which is much larger. Now, in some cases, this gets a little arbitrary because, right, if I walk up to Walgreens to buy something, I'm not really exercising because I'm doing it to do a task. But if I walk to Walgreens and back because I want to get more fit, then it's exercise, even though it's the same thing. Right? So some of this is actually intention. And then, of course, exercise is sort of a modern invention, if you will. Because if you go to any sort of primitive or hunter-gatherer society, they don't understand the concepts of exercise, and they don't understand the concept of training. Even some of those that they study, they talk about, well, this tribe does this big, like, 26-mile run where they kick this ball around to do this thing. It's part of their sort of religious ceremony and culture. And they asked one of the older runners, they were talking about training, and the guy basically said, why would you run if you don't have to? So, this idea of exercise is foreign to them. So, with that said, what I did. So, what did I do? I read a bunch of journal articles related to a few different subjects, inactivity physiology, physical activity and health, physical literacy, and injury and joint dysfunction. Again, I had a terrible time making this talk because there's so much. I could take one or two of those topics and do a whole talk on that. So, I tried to condense and hit some highlights. So that's sort of the science-y or scientific part of what I did. Then I also read several books that were sort of a blend of science, philosophy, ideas, and even practical training. One that I would recommend everyone is Lieberman's book, Exercise. You don't need a background in exercise to understand this whatsoever, but it's fascinating because he's gone and firsthand studied some of these hunter-gatherer tribes and done measurements and really gives a lot of good insight there. A couple of books by Katie Bowman, Move Your DNA, Whole Body Barefoot. She's someone who's got a master's degree in biomechanics, but really focuses on movement outside of exercise. She's one of those people who takes it to the nth degree. Her kids do a homeschool that's outdoor where they're moving the whole time. She took almost all the furniture out of her house. She built a monkey bar down the hallway of her house so people could hang and swing and do things like that. I don't know if you want to take it that far, but interesting stuff. And then the practice of natural movement by Erwin LaCour is more of it's some philosophical things related to what he considers natural movement, which there's no universal definition for. But then there's also some practical things that they teach in there. I listened to a bunch of podcasts too, just to get an idea of the culture, philosophy, some of the ideas related to human movement. Again, outside of just the strictly like exercise realm where, I elevate my heart rate to this percentage of max for this many minutes a day and do this and this and this. But I wanted to go beyond that. And then of course I just tinkered with some skill training. So, what did I learn? A few things. How are we doing with exercise guidelines? Well, what are they? American College of Sports Medicine says 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise. That sounds overwhelming. Most people think moderate intensity means like, you're almost dying. No, moderate intensity is fast walking. It's not quite as bad as you think. Now, doing this at this pace while you read your phone is not moderate intensity, but a purposeful brisk walk meets the definition. So, 25 minutes of walking a day actually gets you there. Strength train 2 times a week. Okay, great. How are we doing? Oh, crud. Little over 20% of adults meet guidelines. It's worse in adolescents. For all the information that's out there, we know so much about exercise and the benefits. And right, ask the average American, should I exercise? Is it good for me? Oh yeah, I should do it, but yet most of them clearly don't. So the way we've been framing exercise, the public health messaging, the whole thing that goes with it, clearly hasn't been all that effective. And so, even interestingly, I read one of the studies and I was thumbing through them yesterday. I noticed it was from Sweden, but I have just observationally noticed the same thing. Because it's like, how are people getting more sedentary when I seem to see a lot of people into fitness? But actually, it seems like there's this, again, I had said this before I ever read the study, a polarization. We have sedentary people who don't really do much activity at all, and then we have very active people. Well, the very active people pull that average up and make it look a little wonky at times, but not many people meet the guidelines. 25% of people are basically not active at all. They get themselves back and forth to their food and bathrooms and cars, and that's pretty much it. So that's not all an uncommon thing. What's also interesting is, statistically, people who exercise don't actually have any less inactive time statistically than people who don't. Just because exercise typically makes up so few of the minutes per week that you would take. So, for instance, even if I meet my 150 minutes per week there, I hit 150, great. Just assuming you're awake 12 hours a day, which people are typically awake longer than that, there's a little over 5,000 minutes per week. So spending 150 of them exercising is still a relatively small proportion of our time. So it's not associated with any significantly different inactive time. So in other words, even people who exercise are typically sedentary unless they're in that little defined time block where they're doing their exercise. Voluntary physical activity in this study was 2% of waking time. You'll see numbers that vary there, but the numbers are always pretty small. That's sort of the lesson that we learn here. And so, what do we know? We know physical activity and health, overall activity is related to health benefits. Note I said overall activity, not just exercise necessarily. Okay? Even low intensity exercise has metabolic benefits. So this idea, again, having worked a little bit in the healthcare part of things earlier in my career, and just being around people, I noticed that a lot of times people, and this happens with diet too and nutrition, since that's my other background, is people very often have this all or none mentality. Like, I can't possibly meet those guidelines, so I just won't do anything. Kind of like, it's just not worth it, I can't meet the goal anyhow. But in reality, even just, standing up and moving around for a couple minutes every half an hour or hour has benefits. Right? Glucose and insulin action, those things work better even if the activity is very, very light. So glucose levels in the blood drop more quickly. Promotes insulin sensitivity, lipoprotein lipase, which helps mobilize fatty acids so we can burn them. Again, I don't intend to turn this into any sort of biochemistry lesson because I'm not that great at that anyway. But these levels, again, we see this even with very low levels of skeletal muscle contraction. So even the low level of contraction I'm doing standing up here is stimulating some of these mechanisms. More so than the mechanisms that you all are using as you sit, right? No judgment, but so we see that any movement can help. We also see that the amount and distribution of sedentary behavior affect health risks. This is interesting. So almost everyone would say, yeah, I know, being inactive more is bad for me, right? But in reality, it's not just the total time. It is also related to how often can you break that sedentary time up. So there's research that shows even if I say okay, you sit for 8 hours in a day, if I take one person and basically have them sit that 8 hours more or less uninterrupted, and I take another person and they stand up and do light activity every 30 minutes, even though they both accumulated 8 hours of sitting, the one who broke the activity up metabolically looks more favorable, looks better, seems to enhance health markers. So even if you can break up your sedentary time or your sitting time, it tends to help. So now here's the big question, right? We said exercise is sort of a modern invention. Many postulate, essentially, humans invented exercise to try and compensate for the fact that our survival is less dependent on physical movement and activity. Right? So, you go from hunter-gatherer, agriculture, then post-industrial, we really didn't have to move as much. And even since then, in the last 100 years, the amount of actual manual physical labor required for livelihood and survival keeps going down and down and down. So, how does exercise do? Does it offset a sedentary lifestyle? The answer is no, or at least not completely. No, or not completely. So, it's if you're fairly inactive and you start exercising, does that help your health? Does it have health benefits? Yes. Does it completely cancel out all the sedentary time? No, it doesn't. So this is quite interesting because, again, coming from an exercise background, we tend to think about okay, I give person this activity, this exercise, and then their body adapts to it, and that's the thing that we're after, right? That adaptation makes my muscles bigger or stronger. It makes my heart and cardiovascular system remodel and do things in a certain way that enhances performance and enhances health. But what we often forget about is the fact that our body is adapting to stimulus 24 hours a day, all the time. So, if on one hand, 23 hours a day you're telling your body, adapt to being sedentary, and 1 hour a day you say, adapt to doing exercise, you see how some of the benefit of that exercise, you may not get the full benefit because you're giving it the opposite signal way more often than you're giving it the exercise signal. So what's interesting is that physical inactivity is associated with increased mortality and disease risk, even in people who meet those guidelines. So this is what a lot of people wouldn't expect. What we have to do now is separate physical inactivity as a risk factor from exercise. It's a separate thing. It's almost like your overall physical activity is sort of the background noise, and then you put exercise on top of that. There's been various studies that sort of show this. Ryan et al. In 2015 basically found people who, they did fitness testing, they're pretty fit, by standards are fit people. But they found the fit group, the people who did the most sitting, still had a 65% increase in mortality risk compared to the fit people who didn't sit as much. They found people who were exercising more than 7 hours per week. That's a lot of exercise in a week for an average person with an actual job and life and that sort of thing. They even found, even amongst that subgroup, that those who did the most sitting had a 50% higher risk of dying of cardiovascular disease than the same people in that group who didn't sit as much. So what we see is exercise has health benefits, but it can't completely offset inactivity. Also interesting, this study by Aikens, they had people basically do bed rest for like 3 days or so, and then gave them an hour of really hard exercise. Typically that really hard exercise shows metabolic effects that last during the exercise but then persist afterwards. Well, what they found was those effects didn't persist afterwards very well at all when they were done in the background of inactivity. So it's like they deemed this like exercise resistance. So prolonged sedentary time will make you somewhat resistant to the positive effects of exercise. So again, it's like, oh, So it makes us think about something a little different than most people think about. You know, they postulated that 60 to 75 minutes of activity is needed per day to offset a sedentary lifestyle. Certainly more than 150 minutes per week. So, well, what other ways can we look at this, or how can we find very active people? Well, look at hunter-gatherer societies. So a lot of this, all this comes from Lieberman's research in his book. Interestingly, so hunter-gatherers and disease. He studied, the big one he studied is the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, that he studied extensively. Type 2 diabetes is almost non-existent in this group. Blood pressure does not rise in age, with age. Typical Americans, you know, it's sort of a foregone conclusion. Your blood pressure is going to rise as you get older. Not the case here. More walking associated with lower respiratory infections or rate of them. Grip strength is better maintained. Again, we have this idea that with age, all these things deteriorate. But what do we base that idea on? Well, it's based on research. Yeah, research of who? Postmodern, industrialized countries, probably heavily skewed towards Caucasians, quite frankly. That's where most of the research has been done. So outside of that context, and I've said this for years, like, how much of the problem with aging is aging itself and how much is the inactivity associated with aging? It's hard to separate those out. These hunter-gatherer tribes give us a little bit of insight about, you know, what might be happening. But they maintain better grip strength. Their osteoporosis rates, we notice, are higher in post-industrial countries, which seems odd. Like, they would have better diets and better health care and all sorts of better stuff, yet they have less osteoporosis in these hunter-gatherer groups. Osteoarthritis risk has doubled in Americans since World War II. Why would we get so much more arthritis? The answer is we're not sure, right? That was one of the things I looked at in literature, and I didn't put much up here because the answer is we don't know, right? You know, repetitive movements as an occupation seem to be an osteoarthritis risk. In some studies, BMI or weight is associated, in some it's not. So it's a little bit unclear what causes that, but you know, it's an interesting correlation. And then Alzheimer's is 20 times more common in industrial countries, industrialized countries. So interesting. So hunter-gatherers versus Americans. So again, using the Hadza's data. They have about 4 hours of light activity, 2 hours of moderate activity, and 20 minutes of vigorous activity per day. Right? And they don't exercise by our definition. This is hunting, gathering, foraging, cooking, surviving. The average American, 5.5 hours of light activity, 20 minutes of moderate activity, and 1 minute of vigorous activity, or less than 1 minute, really. So we see here a big difference. If you add up the time, on average, the Hadza would spend about 560 minutes per week in moderate or vigorous activity. The average American about 140 minutes per week. So a significant difference for sure. Now what's interesting is this physical activity level. This is just energy expenditure compared to just resting. So just resting would be 1.0, right? Well, what's interesting is a sedentary American, we see their resting or their metabolic rate, and the hunter-gatherer, you're like, with as active as they are, at least my first impression would be like, shouldn't their number be a lot higher, right? Especially compared to an exerciser. Well, you know, this really speaks to the efficiency of the human body in terms of, you know, what we have to remember is, you know, and Lieberman argues this throughout, is that we shouldn't guilt or shame people because they don't exercise, because quite frankly, we're hardwired not to needlessly expend calories, right? We're made to burn calories for reproduction and survival. Anything outside of that is needless, and so, but what we see here is the body clearly gets very efficient with the energy intake it has, so that even if you're very active, I can decrease your risk of starving to death by monkeying with your metabolism. So, this was an interesting thing. Of course, wild mammals expend a lot more energy, interestingly. So, hunter-gatherers walk 6 to 9 miles a day, about 20,000 steps. Now, the magic number we all know is what?
10,000.
10,000 is what you hear, right? The latest data I looked at said it's probably more like 7,000 to 7,500 steps is where you get most of the benefit. But like I told my class earlier this week, I'm okay with still telling people 10,000, knowing that if I tell them to work out 5 days a week, they'll work out 3, right? It gives you some fudge factor, so if you don't quite meet the target, you still actually met the target. Plus 10,000 is easier to remember. Average American, less than 5,000. Japan, 6,000. So again, they walk a lot more, take a lot more steps. Hasda women walk 2 times as much as American women with little decline in age. Conversely, American women are about half as active in their 70s as they are in their 40s. So, what does this tell us? And then what we see here about the functional implications is Hasda women, their maximum walking speed is 1.1 meters per second. Maximum walking speed is also correlated with mortality risk. It's functional ability. And it really doesn't decline much at all with age. American women are close to that when they're under 50, but by the time they hit their 60s, they've declined by like a third. So, what this largely points to is the fact that lots of our decrease in activity with aging is probably social and cultural as much or more than it is sheer aging. It also gives us some hope that if you maintain a high level of activity as you age, you have a better chance of maintaining more of your overall abilities. So I thought that was interesting as well. One other note before I leave this I thought was interesting. Lieberman has done a lot of research on this, obviously, but he even went and tested what we would consider like athletic abilities in these groups. How fast can they run? How high can they jump? How strong are they? Various strength measurements. What he found was those capabilities did decline with age, but typically those like in their 60s were maybe down 20 to 30% from their peak abilities, which were in their 20s. Right? You think, oh, well, yes, it declines, but it's like, well, wait a minute. How many of our college athletes right now, who are presumably at or near their peak athletic abilities, will still have 70 to 80% of those capabilities in 4 decades? Well, if we look around at Americans in their 60s, that seems highly unlikely. They're going to decline a lot more than 20 to 30%. Just, again, I don't have data to prove that, but a set of eyeballs will probably suffice there. Another concept I came across was physical literacy. And so this spoke to me, and this is a very distilled breakdown of this physical literacy concept that we're actually putting into the kinesiology department and building into this new health sciences and human movement major. So it's got 3 main aspects. Again, this is the simplest version of it, and I like simple and concise, so this is the sort of way I did it. So to have physical literacy, it doesn't just mean being able to do like cool acrobatic tricks and lift 1,000 pounds. That's not really the point. The point is something more holistic. First of all, you have to find some motivation and movement in meaning, or meaning in movement, simply because telling people, hey, moving a lot's good for you and it makes you healthy, is clearly not enough to get people moving. They need something more than that. They need a deeper meaning and reason why. And until we start getting at that with people, it doesn't matter how much we tell them they need to move, they're probably not going to move. So they need to find a truly motivating reason. Second, we want to build movement skills. And again, this is not about like high-level athleticism or acrobatic tricks. What it's about is actually building movement skills so people have more confidence. One of the biggest barriers to people exercising or moving regularly is they don't have confidence in their ability to do things. So in other words, the number one rule you often hear with a personal trainer, they'll say, don't make people look or feel stupid. That's the number one rule. Well, if you're going to go do a physical task in a room with other people around, and you feel like you don't know what you're doing, there's a good chance you're just not going to do it, because you don't want to look foolish. I don't know how to use a machine. I don't know how to lift the weight. I don't know how to do the thing. And we hear this as a common barrier. So that's why we want to build at least enough movement skills so that people have a lot of options, right? They have many options. And then, of course, we want them to have the ability to adjust activities to the situation. So if we really break this down, this comes down to sort of the classical exercise programming type of stuff that exercise science traditionally does, right? Okay, well, you start at this percent of this, and you do this, and you structure this program, then you adjust it over time. That requires, obviously, a fairly extensive knowledge of, human anatomy and physiology, how we respond to exercise, all of that stuff. But to have true physical literacy, which is what we're shooting for, we want this to, we need all three of these things to be in place. Again, there's evidence to back up all of this. People who feel more competent in their motor skills are more likely to have higher physical activity levels. The modern culture of movement, some things that, you sort of pick up with books that you observationally say, okay, this makes sense. We already talked about, movement equals exercise, and we have to set aside specific time for movement. This is an idea. Also, movement's largely not necessary to a large extent for our survival. Like how much moving did you really have to do today to survive? I mean, some, obviously, but, movement is largely optional. And when humans have the option not to move, they tend to not move. And then we have exercise as medicine. This is a push from the American College of Sports Medicine, and I think the intention is good. It's the idea of getting health professionals and physicians more thinking about, like, exercise is like a medicine. I need to prescribe it to my patients or send them to someone who can prescribe it adequately, with the dosage and the whole thing. Now, I think Lieberman and myself would argue that in some ways I see the positives, but there's also some issues with this messaging. One, when I say medicine, most people say, heck yes, I like to take medicine, right? No, I saw it from the time my kids were toddlers. Medicine's yucky, Well, a lot of us maintain that idea, maybe a little more sophisticated, but same idea as we get older. Like, oh, medicine means there's something wrong, okay? And then the other issue with medicine is, and in exercise. Well, a lot of people have negative connotations of exercise, right? I have to be a pile of sweat and blood and vomit and feel like I'm going to die to get exercise. Like, that's their picture, that is their mental picture of exercise, and it turns people off. And we also know that medicalizing exercise has not really helped people become more active overall, even though there's good intentions there and there's good things within there. So that's why I say question, I don't know. Culture values moving as little as possible when we look at it. Our technology and our wealth essentially outsource movement, right? I didn't have to pull my garage door open this morning because I clicked the button, and then when I get home, I'll click the button to open the thing again. And, we drive. Okay, yeah. Some of this is very obvious, right? There are some people in here, myself included, who are of an age where not all of our TVs have remote controls, which is unfathomable to our current students, right? Like, you have to walk 3 steps and click the thing, and yeah. But there's only 3 channels, so there wasn't that much flipping around to do anyway. But, we do that. But even wealth, and these were some examples that were like, oh, I never thought of it that way. We essentially pay people to move for us. Well, how is that? Well, if I go to our cafeteria here and I eat some food, well, where did that food come from? Well, it was probably grown in the ground or mooing somewhere some time ago. Someone had to go cut that crop and haul it and harvest it and do the processing and do the thing and then get it here and do, well, who did that? Well, more than likely someone who has less money than us than we paid to go harvest the thing. So you see how indirectly, like, we are outsourcing the movement to them. Yeah, I don't want to do all that to make a meal. I'll just pay for the convenient meal that someone else has done all the actual physical labor for. So we outsource movement. And again, movement and exercise are largely to agree with is if we want more people to move, we have to change this and make movement fun and necessary, not optional and voluntary. So, what are some other new ideas? Movement is an essential nutrient. It's not optional. You develop a disease if it's deficient. This, again, the nutrition analogies always speak to me anyway, but this is interesting, right? Would we call vitamin C medicine for scurvy? Right? Most people say, well, in a technical sense it'll cure it, but the reason you got it in the first place is because you were deficient in vitamin C, right? So in many ways, like movement as medicine is actually like, well, we're trying to cure a movement deficiency that may have largely contributed to the disease in the first place. So you see how that's a little backwards. Movement quantity is not enough. I need to move more. That's a great first step. I like Katie Bowman's quote, move more and move more of your parts. You can move a lot overall and still have relatively sedentary parts of your body. Right? How much upper body strength does an elite marathon runner have? Not much. Right? Some of them literally have trouble carrying their own groceries. But they get a lot of physical activity. They can move for a long time. So thinking like, move more, exercise less, or play more and exercise less. It's a thought process. The more you move and the more you just sort of play and do stuff, the less exercise that is probably necessary. Right? You may still need some formal exercise or desire some, but you might not need near as much as you think. Again, it would be practically difficult for us to go into a hunter-gatherer mode now, but, move more. Combine movement with other tasks. This is, again, Bowman's idea of stacking. So, she does a lot of her meetings related to work over the phone while she walks and things like that. So you're walking while you're meeting. You're doing different things like that. And then simply require more movement. Make things less convenient. I know she said like the dishes and the pans and pots she cooks with most frequently, she puts way at the back of stuff or way up high. Not where you could wipe. You got to bend and reach and do different movements than you're used to in order to get there. So make your life a little less convenient. So what did I create? Create's loosely used here because I'm sure I borrowed, plagiarized, and stole these ideas and somehow repackaged them in my mind. So I'll give you the disclaimer. I sort of looked at the worldviews of movement based on what I had observed and what I read. One I call a fitness-centered worldview. This is what most people have. Movement equals exercise, and they typically focus on building specific fitness attributes. I'm here to build strength today. Tomorrow I'm going to do my cardio, and then afterwards I'm going to do my flexibility, right? I have all these specific attributes that I build sort of in a hodgepodge or Frankenstein-esque way. You can often be sedentary outside of workouts. And again, even people who don't exercise still tend to have this worldview. Right? They're just like, I should do it, I just don't. Right? So again, it's more about building specific attributes necessarily than functional ability. Now, I came up even with subtypes. There's the bodybuilding, body sculpting, sort of appearance-focused people. Right? Just get on the internet and, Instagram aplenty, perfect lighting and, everyone needs to see me working out in some state of undress every day, apparently. But, honestly, we all have a little bit of this in us, right? Hey, if like this exercise thing makes me look a little better, I'm okay with that too, right? Some have more of a fitness performance idea. There's a very popular brand name that even has their own sort of fitness games now, right? Where you compete in the sport of fitness, essentially. So they're sort of blurring some lines. There are people who do want to build attributes for health. So in some cases, like, well, I'm building strength and endurance because it's good for my health, and it does work for that, but there may be still some holes in their movement. There's an activity or sport-centered worldview that I thought about. Movement is doing fun activity or sports. That's what they associate with movement, not necessarily formal exercise. all right? Fitness is a secondary benefit or just something that's sort of an inconvenience that I need a little bit of to do the thing I really like to do, right? So, you know, this is our basketball players who don't like to go lift weights. Basketball players like to play basketball, right? Like that's, some of it see the weight room as the necessary evil so they can play basketball a little better. Competitive sports, there's a question about whether this really learns to long-term activity. Right, you know, I tell our football players, you probably need to find something else to do when you're done because you can't really play football the rest of your life. Your body's going to be broken enough after these 4 years probably. So there's a question there. Now, outdoor activities seem more likely to maintain long-term. You know, your hiking, your biking, your outdoor type of things. The subtypes here, I said is sort of the purest, the activities only. Like, I love to hike and that's what I want to do and that's all I will do. I will not do any other training to make my hiking better. I just want to hike because I don't like any of that other stuff. Or a fortified activity mindset is like, okay, I'll add a little exercise training to make my activity better or to supplement it a little bit. Okay, so that's where I see those folks. And then finally, this is sort of the new niche or the weirdos like myself who look at more of a movement-centered worldview and say, okay, movement and movement skills are an end unto themselves. So instead of starting with the strength and endurance attributes I want to build, I work on movements that have practical value, and then I use the movement skills to build the fitness attributes. It's a distinction, but it's an important one. So instead of trying to like build all the parts and then go apply them to a skill, I work on the skill to build the parts so I can do the skill better. That's sort of the idea. The idea here is you only isolate strength or some specific physical attribute unless it's holding back, the only time you would want to do that is if it's inhibiting some skill that you really want. Okay? So, if, you're finding that, whatever, your handstand training is inhibited because of some upper body strength, you might do a little supplemental upper body weightlifting so that you can hold that handstand position a little better, things like that. You could maintain this long term because you could just simply build different movement skills or tinker with things forever. The natural movement people focus on evolution, what they would consider evolutionary ancestral movements, right? This is MoveNat. Okay, what does that hunter-gatherer in this very varied environment need? Well, they need to be able to run and jump and crawl and swim and have self-defense and climb and, right? Those are considered natural movements to them. Others are like, that's an arbitrary distinction. But then a different way to think of this is a skill-based. I focus on specific skills to improve overall movement. Not necessarily practicality, but in some cases, yes. So, how do we tie this together? How does this work? Again, all of these have a different sort of mindset and a way that you would go about training. And in some ways, I think maybe if we could turn people onto thinking differently about exercise and specifically activity, we might open doors for them that they didn't realize were options. Now, Rafe Kelly, who's a guy who has a company called Evolve, Move, Play, he talked about this, and I thought this was interesting. He said, we tend to think of exercise and movement as a mechanical or an engineering problem. He said, in reality, I think it's more like an ecosystem. So by ecosystem, he meant, there was one example and I read, and I don't have all the details completely figured out, but it was essentially, I think they reintroduced wolves to an area that they had been gone, and that ended up changing the course of a river because of all the downstream effects that well, there's more predators here, so there's fewer of this or more of this, and so they ate the grass here, they didn't eat this grass, and so he's like, it's sort of this ecosystem that has these upstream and downstream effects that aren't even always predictable. So then I was brain like, oh no, this is a movement ecosystem. Our outputs are functional ability and health. Well, strength, flexibility, and motor control, I borrowed this from GMB Fitness, that builds movement capability. Movement capability gives me how many physical activities I have the ability to do, and then I perform them with some sort of volume, intensity, and variety, which feeds back to my basic movement capacity. but it also feeds forward into tissue and joint integrity, cardiovascular function, metabolic function. Collectively, we kind of call that health in a lot of ways, right? Movement capability tells me about functional ability, but I also have to have a functional, healthy system to do that. All right? Now, functional ability could be your ability to live independently on your own, and functional ability could be your athletic performance, right? It can be a broad thing. But, you know, what I see is like all these factors up here interact with one another, and this system can get tilted one way or another, and some of the effects aren't even predictable. So, again, you know, I just took something and said, you know, don't be such a reductionist about movement, and then I reduced it to a diagram. But as my department members know, I spend way too much time constructing goofy diagrams. But these help me think and learn and see things. So I think this is an important concept that we see. But these feedback loops, I think, are important. Because if we skew this one way or another, we end up with issues, a lot of times health issues. Even inactive exercisers, they can skew this to health issues because of repetitive movements, right? That end up causing tissue and joint integrity problems, or other things like that. So I also came up with a way to sort of try to look at what are my gaps in movement. So I call this the fun and functional. This is what we want to be. We want to have fun and be functional. So, are you functional? And again, I diagrammed this like 18 different ways, and this is how I came up with this, right? There's 3 tiers in both. 1, functional. Can you just do your life stuff? Can you live and survive? Everyday activities. Then, sort of slightly irregular activities, right? I don't haul bags of mulch into my backyard every day, but I do it on a quasi-annual basis, right? Do I have the physical capability to do that? That's sort of like, okay, check the box, I'm functional. Now, some people aren't, right? Or they have, or at least there's areas of their function that they struggle with. Next tier though, if I've more or less got that, then it's like, could I handle reasonable emergencies or chaos? Right? Holy crap, the fire alarms just went off, could we all get out of the building quickly enough to survive? That's a reasonable emergency, right? Not that like 25 tigers got let loose in the room or something, you know, like, okay, that only happens in movies, right? And then tier 3, which is like, you know, the only people who reach tier 3 are like, you know, I don't know, you know, Navy SEALs and stuff, you know. They can survive any natural disaster and kill everyone in the room, you know, kind of thing. Like, well, okay, most people don't need that. But then, also importantly, are you able to do the fun stuff and perform well? So, I divided this up into, can you do just sort of easy recreational activities? Right? You know, so again, if you're like, my idea of fun is hiking Kilimanjaro, well, that's not really an easy recreational activity, right? It's going for a leisurely hike. Tier 2 is, can I do more vigorous, right? If a sand volleyball game breaks out, or a flag football game, or you know, touch, can I actually run around without tearing a hamstring or blowing my knee out, kind of thing? Which, you know, gets more and more tedious the more years we get on us, I think. And then, of course, are you ready for anything? So the idea is that, like, to survive and have some quality of life, I think you probably need to hit tier 1. Tier 2 gives you a lot more options. And then finally we double back and say, but even if I'm okay, am I doing something now that's going to lead to a health problem later? Okay? So I'm doing things that counteract the biases of life and my hobbies, right? Life tends to do this to us, right? Am I doing something to counteract that? That's what I'm talking about. Or if you have a particular sport, right? I read one person that said, don't live in your sporting posture, because it's usually not healthy long term. So am I counteracting some of that? Are maintaining joint integrity, and then again, strength, muscle function, cardiovascular function. So how do I use this? Identify your gaps and check your health. Prioritize your gaps. What's your most limiting ability that's affecting your quality of life? Start with that and see what you can do with it. Again, within your control, right? Some of the stuff's without, you know, hey, when I was younger, I broke this ankle and it just doesn't, it's never going to work completely right again. Okay. But once you figured that out then, what's the limiting factor? Is it your capability? Can you physically just not do it? Is it due to an injury or ability, right? Those are different. Is it a capacity thing? By capacity, I mean, I can get 1 bag of mulch out of there, but after 2 or 3, I am just in trouble. but I need to get 10 bags of mulch every year, right? That's capacity. You have the ability to do it, but you got to be able to do more of it. Or is it that like I have the physical ability, I just got to learn how to do this thing better. And then attack the things in order of priority. Again, this is overly complicated in my, but I use this in my, I did it early in the semester with my movement class. I'm going to do it again at the end. Had them doing different things. Like, hey, where are your gaps? Some of them have to search hard because they're talented athletes, but there's still some. It's amazing the things that are relatively simple for me, a guy in his mid-40s, who can do that they can't, even though athletically they're far superior to where I'm at. So what did I put in the curriculum? How is this going to affect things? One, focus on physical literacy. In fact, our our learning outcomes for the whole department are simply those 3 points of physical literacy now. Everything can fall under that. We want to promote physical literacy. Why? Well, that's essentially what physical education is, but so should exercise, science, and everything else be. So we want to cultivate it first in our students. You can't teach someone to do something you have never done, right? Let me show you how to get really strong in the gym. Well, have you ever done it? Well, no, but I read books about it. You're going to lack some credibility, and quite frankly, there are real-world things about doing it that you just can't learn in a classroom. We tell our students that all the time, and they don't believe us. Then they go do an internship and say, "You were right." Yeah, and then equip them to cultivate physical literacy in others. Explore motivation and meaning related to movement. Again, get beyond the nuts and bolts. We're really good at the nuts and bolts because we all tend to be sort of science-minded, but we got to get beyond that. Develop some movement skills to give them options, and then explore movement activities outside of formal exercise. So, and again, we've injected this in all levels of our curriculum. More non-exercise physical activity physiology. So again, some of that light exercise physiology we talked about. More mechanobiology and mechanotransduction. This is simply the process by which putting pressure on the cells in my body actually changes the gene expression and the structure of those cells. In exercise, we always think about like the cardiovascular system adapts and the muscles adapt. But when you really think about this, and Bowman points this out painstakingly, those things happen because individual cells literally have forces that compress them or pull on them or provide a shear force, and it changes the cytoskeleton and the structure of those cells. And when you have enough of those cells that change, then the tissue itself changes and adapts, and we see that. So we've incorporated we've always touched on this, but we've emphasized this a little bit more in some interesting ways, I think, because again, this even gets into this non-exercise stuff in terms of how the body adapts and how the body does certain things, because not all adaptations are due to exercise, and we see this in certain sports all the time. For instance, in martial artists or football players, they literally almost get a callousing that happens on their skin so that, early in training camp, they hit the ground a lot and they're all bruised up and beat up and sore and they hurt. But later in the season, those same amount of falls don't do all that because literally that tissue from the impact adapts. That's just an example. And then, of course, we incorporated much of this into the health sciences and human movement major in the human movement and health course. So again, this is, the course will take all of these points today and expand them much, much, much more broadly. It's a comprehensive view of movement that talks about motivation and meaning, movement skills, and lifestyle skills. Because I want our future health practitioners to have those things. And not just hand them, here's your exercise prescription, here's your rehab exercises. That's great. But if they don't go home and do them, they don't do any good. So that's where the motivation and the skill and some of that. And again, I learned this in my healthcare career. They had us calculating milligrams of cholesterol and percents of saturated fat and all sorts of stuff, in my training. And then I'm like, when I'm sitting with real people, I'm like, I never do this. Like, no one calculates all this stuff. If I could get them to eat fewer fried chicken skin sandwiches and decrease their portions a little, that's as far as I'm getting with anybody, right? So I got a real, education and, working with real people is not the same as checking all the science boxes necessarily. the science helps us give recommendations, but there's a total another skill in getting people to do it. So we're working on incorporating even more of that into our curriculum, especially for our health sciences people, because they're going to work with real life people. So, that's kind of what we're doing. Again, I know I covered a ton of stuff, and I tried to keep the time reasonable. Some references, questions.
I have a question. I can start. So I think you know this. A few of you know I have diabetes. I have type 1 diabetes. So I'm really interested in how activity affects like my own blood sugars and insulin and everything. But do you ever think we'll get to the point where doctors will actually recommend physical activity and insurance will cover the cost or help cover the cost of fitness trainers or things like that?
I think the ACSM with that exercise is medicine push, I think that's what they're that's what they're working towards, that's the goal. Because I saw the same, there was a time in my healthcare career where it was questionable whether physical therapy was covered by insurance, and now it's much more universally covered, at least to some extent, right? They probably still put a silly limit on it or something, but they're working their way towards that, right? It used to be, nutrition counseling wasn't covered either. Now for certain medical conditions, they'll cover that. So I think the ACSM, I think that's the intention. I think it's a good intention too, by the way. It's going to get more people into those services and get the people in those fields actually paid for their services. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. It's just like everything else, it takes some time to sort of change the culture and that sort of thing.
Not so much a question, but maybe you can riff on it a little. The early stat that adolescents aren't even meeting the activity levels, but yet we have gym class throughout much of schooling is a bit disturbing. I mean, I know we have a childhood obesity problem, but gosh, isn't that what gym class is for?
It should be, but as I'm noticing even with my 5th grader, who gets 20 minutes of PE 3 times a week.
Yeah, that's not enough.
Right, and what I found ironic about this was the goal of all that was what? Well, we're not meeting academic standards, so we need to spend more time doing academic stuff and pull out. Realistically, what actually they find out is give them more activity. That doing that doesn't seem to have had the effect on the academic performance we'd like, and in fact, they might be better off being more active.
Yeah.
And so. But that's part of the issue too, is physical education is sort of I'll say a convoluted mess nationwide because the standards are different everywhere, and some places you gotta do more than others, and you can opt in and you can opt out. And some places, quite frankly, it's done really well, and some places it's not. I know our majors do really well because I know what they learn and I know what Carrie does with them. And as I've been doing all this, I'm just and she's like, this is sort of like adult PE. I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. That's kind of what we're after. So yeah, it's unfortunate, but this is my opinion only. At a certain point, it's going to be very difficult if we can't get the culture of the community and the homes regarding physical activity changed. Right? We all know that despite all of our best intentions, things in schools can't completely offset the things in the homes, unfortunately for some kids. We're trying, I know, and it's difficult for schools. And I think physical education and activity is in the same boat. So that's why it's it's a good place to start. If we can change the culture in those kids, maybe a generation from now can start to do that, but it's still tough. So that's why I'm trying to look at meaning, motivation. How can we get at some of these groups that are physically inactive? What's a way to get them more active, right? And it's not always gym memberships and things like that. It's just, but trying to find, I guess if I had found that thing, I'd be making a lot more money right now. But, but searching for that thing, I think, is important. But yeah, it's interesting. And my kids, they do well in PE, but it's mostly because of the stuff they do at home and with us, not because of what they,
Yeah.
And And at times I'm slightly horrified at what kids can and can't do at certain ages. Well, not slightly, I'm very horrified, quite frankly. Again, I don't think all kids need to be world champion athletes, just, but just basic things, that you'd want out of people, so. Other questions or comments, issues?
I guess I just have a quick one on that. I mean, in a lot of European countries, there is no PE or there's no sports programming in school. And so then, if they're on a soccer team, that's something they've opted into outside of school. Yet we run most of that through our public schools. Did you notice in your reading or looking at literature any distinctions between activity levels and health in some of those situations?
Not that I could link to the differences in the way the schools do things.
Mm-hmm.
The culture, the fact that their cities tend to be much more compressed and people bike, by bike and by foot a lot. I think that, and just culturally, I think it's different.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the differences I see. But no, other than that, of course, the youth sports culture in the United States is problematic. Talk about movement variety. Well, you got 8-year-olds specializing in sports already, and then, having their first shoulder surgery by junior high, which, you want people to be active, but yet we're, kind of probably moving in the wrong direction on that thing too. And, despite all the youth sports, I've talked to our coaches, the athletes aren't any better when they get to college than they did before youth sports were prominent. Like, they're just more injured by the time they get to college, that's all. I read a quote by someone who said, like, if you're going to specialize in a sport, if you're not elite in 3 years, you're not going to be elite in that sport. And I thought about that, and I was like, that might be kind of close to right. I guess, I don't know if we should worry about our 8-year-old being the best 8-year-old baseball player in the state or not, kind of thing. Again, like I said, some of this is purely my opinion. Yours may be different. It's okay. Any other questions? So if you see Jen Braun tromping her class up and down stairs or standing on half foam rollers, or you see me outside having kids roll around in the grass or climb trees, we're putting some of the stuff into practice. Hopefully we can change the culture of movement on the campus. We got to start somewhere. Okay, well, thanks for coming. Go move, right? Do something.